Like so many terrible conflicts in history, the loss of life in what would be the final year of the First Succession War is all the more tragic because every side by this point understood that a ceasefire was imminent. After 3.5 decades of carnage, they could no longer continue to wage total war against one another. Yet despite this, those in charge persisted in ordering raids and even 11th hour invasions right up to the bitter end. The Capellans had managed to force the Marik militia off Kwamashu the previous year, but ultimately withdrew once House Allison sent in reinforcements. Ilsa Liao's main focus was on the Davion front. A raid on Helixmar and the capture of Rollis kicked off 2821 before she launched her final land grab in February. The CCAF made use of fast-moving Locust battle mechs to run rings around the garrison on Ulaanbaatar, taking back control of the contested system. Striking at targets of opportunity across their respective border, Davion and Kurita also undertook their final raids of the war. The AFFS would take this one step further, a late invasion seizing control of the immensely wealthy New Aberdeen, in the hopes it could help rebuild the devastated Draconis March. The proximity of the fighting caused the nearby Anting University to organise its student body into 4 regiments, offering their services to the DCMS as their rivals from the Sunzang Military Academy had for many years. Colonel Raymond Hempsted had spent the latter years of the war training one of the Lyran Guards regiments in fast attack tactics and manoeuvre warfare, hoping they would become the spiritual successor to the famed stealths. Lyran High Command, spurred on by the successful capture of Utrecht at the beginning of the year, ordered a last-minute jab at the Draconis Combine as a way to trial their new performance. Now known as Hempsted's Greyhounds, the unit was dispatched on a deep raid against Otho, an attack that would prove disastrous. Despite his tutelage, the regiment was still untested, and the engagement on Otho proved to be their last. Hempsted, who had unsuccessfully petitioned to be sent along with his students, was distraught by their loss. Richard Steiner meanwhile was enraged that such a foolish venture had been attempted and demoted all those responsible. He recalled the former stealth commander back to Tharkad. When Hempsted arrived, the Archon declared that the former Amaris Empire soldier was to be promoted to Hauptmann General and given command of training operations within the LCAF. Furthermore, he was dispatched to the Kuritan front to take full control of the region. In the last and perhaps most ill-conceived move of the war, Captain General Thaddeus Marik decided to launch an attack on Judoné in April in retaliation for a raid on Wing. The planet had fallen to the Commonwealth some 3 decades earlier, but rather than try to use it as a bargaining chip in the ongoing peace talks on Bella, he decided to take it by force. Leaving his flagship in orbit, Thaddeus took to the field to take command of the operation. On May 7th, as he met with his officers to discuss tactics for the upcoming battle, an artillery shell impacted his tent, and the Captain General was killed. In an ironic twist, just 9 days later, Marik and Steiner would sign the peace accord of Bella I, the First Nations of the Succession Wars to formally end the conflicts between them. When the Minister of Tikhonov, Dmitry Rogozin, tentatively called for an armistice around Chesterton, he found that the Federated Sons was open to the suggestion, with a formal truce agreed on September 24th. Likewise, Duke Jonathan Humphreys approached the Capellan Confederation looking to establish a ceasefire, which Ilsa Liao ultimately agreed to in late November, ceding control of the contested Andurian systems back over to the Free Worlds League. By December, fighting between the Combine and Commonwealth had tapered off, but there was little hope of ever reaching a peace agreement with such an aggressive militaristic state. The same unofficial ceasefire extended to the Federated Sons border. Raiding still took place, but rarely did it involve even a battalion of ground troops. The surviving successor lords at this time were looking around at the inner sphere to see what their conquests had won them. Certainly, the border regions had been hit hardest, but the loss of civilian transport meant that the human suffering extended deep into each realm, as colonies were forced to abandon their homes or simply left to wither and die without vital food or medical aid. Rationing had been in effect on almost every planet for 3 decades. Throughout our history of the conflict, we've mentioned specific raids when known, but the strikes against those rare naval bases capable of constructing or servicing warships never ceased. 6 more were destroyed over the course of the war, 3 crippled permanently, and another 3 badly damaged. Overall production of jump ships was down by 95% compared to 2786. The Lyran Commonwealth, still the most industrious of the 5 successor states, had their manufacturing output halved. The new Davion military district had lost more than 60% of its industrial capacity, and for House Davion, their income was less than 25% of their pre-war figures. The military losses were extreme. Some of the figures often quoted belie just how bad things were. For example, the Lyran Commonwealth began the war with 120 battlemech regiments on its rolls. Even including those units destroyed or disbanded, wartime production meant that in 28-21 they actually had 10 more mech regiments on the table. But out of all those units, the number of regiments operating just 2 full battalions was 4. And the LCAF was the military that came out of the First Succession War the best. The hardest hit were the armed forces of the Federated Sons, who had lost more than 62% of their strength, primarily fighting House Kurita. The human cost is truly unknowable. The chaos unleashed by absolute total warfare means that any figures will always be estimates. It's beyond question that tens of billions were killed in the First Succession War, but some sources count up into the hundreds of billions once the indirect casualties are factored in. A 28-24 survey by the ComStar Safe Transit and Astronavigation Project found that 22 colonies across the Inner Sphere had been destroyed from either bombardment or nuclear weapons. But on top of that, 31 were wiped out by disease, 72 planets died from famine, and another 23 succumbed to some other disaster. People will naturally ask, who won the First Succession War? The only appropriate answer is, no one did. Every realm came out of the conflict worse than they did when it started, whether they had directly participated in the fighting or not. We can, of course, look at it dispassionately and see that certain parties lost less than others. The Free Worlds League under Kenyan Marik had made enormous inroads into the Capellan Confederation and looked to be well on their way to dealing a knockout blow to House Liao until the invasion stalled. Their biggest accomplishment was reclaiming the ancestral home of both House Humphreys of Andurian and House Orloff of Carbonus. Unfortunately, all that goodwill went up in smoke when Thaddeus Marik secured his position as Captain General through political strong-arming. Their intelligence agency SAFE had also lost the vast majority of their agents outside of the League, leaving them blind to events beyond their borders. Significant losses to the Lyran Commonwealth, notably the Boland Thumb, and a military that was reduced by more than 60% preclude House Marik from being considered the winners. The Capellan Confederation armed forces, despite also suffering 60% casualties, actually gained compared to their immediate rivals, coming out ahead of the FWLM and much closer to the AFFS. However, they had failed to capture their primary objective for the war, Chesterton. Furthermore, several of the worlds taken from the Terran hegemony had been lost to the Draconis Combine, a new dangerous entity on their Corwood border. Coupled with the many systems now belonging to Marik or their allies, House Liao is definitely one of the losers. The Federated Sons' counteroffensive under Paul Davion was amazingly successful, liberating almost all of the worlds they had lost up to that point. It came at an enormous cost, as previously mentioned, but it was nevertheless a victory for the First Prince, who had further cemented his own power at home. But calling the Fed Sons a winner after the humiliation they suffered in the first decade of the conflict is dishonest. They were on the brink of utter destruction, and their recovery was a miracle made possible only through the atrocities committed by their arch-rivals. Further, the civilian population of the Davion realm was one of the worst affected by the conflict, with millions perishing from either starvation or disease after the loss of vital water purification technology on many raided worlds. The Draconis Combine was the only nation to gain on all three fronts, against the Federated Sons, the Lyran Commonwealth, the Terran Hegemony, and through them the Capellan Confederation. Reclaiming the Lyran system was something they took particular pride in. Their military losses, though severe, were not quite as bad as the AFFS who they had campaigned against. At home, these conquests were touted as a great victory for House Kurita, but privately, the collapse of Jinjiro's offensive had been a disaster. For them to come so close to outright domination over House Davion, only to stumble at the final step, was an indignity the Coordinator struggled to deal with. With increasing frequency, Jinjiro was starting to show signs of a degenerative mental condition. Ironically, despite the Lyran Commonwealth armed forces consistently underperforming throughout the entire war, House Steiner came out ahead of their rivals, primarily because the brutal campaigns of Kenyan Marik and Jinjiro Kurita were targeting the opposite side of the Inner Sphere. The LCAF had begun the conflict on a relatively even keel with the FWLM and slightly behind the DCMS. Now, they were almost on par with the mustered soldiery and significantly ahead of the Free Worlds League military. Additionally, the key industrial world of Hesperus had survived 3 separate attempts to destroy it. Its survival guaranteed that House Steiner's armed forces would recover faster than their rivals. What systems the Draconis Combine claimed along their Spinwood border were more than offset by the removal of the Bolan Thumb and capture of Solaris and its neighbouring worlds, though House Kelswa would surely disagree. But as Steiner looked at the condition of those planets, they, like all those who had conquered worlds during the war, quickly discovered the miserable state of affairs on the ground. There was virtually nothing of value left in any of the border systems that so much blood had been spilled over. A shaky peace had slowly crept its way over the Inner Sphere. First between the Free Worlds League and Lyran Commonwealth in May, then the Capellan Confederation and Federated Sons in September. In November, House Humphreys agreed to a peace with Liao, which soon spread to all Marik territories, and by December, the Draconis Combine had ceased all but the most minor of actions against its neighbours. The First Succession War had ended. Word of the ceasefire filtered back to the royal palace on Tharkad. Upon hearing the news, the Archon let out a long sigh. Thank God. It's over.
Absolutely nothing. Yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Say it again, y'all. Look out. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Listen to me.
And just like that, guys, another series of BattleTech Lore and History comes to an end. Looking back on it now, I can say with some confidence that this has been the most fun to put together. Yes, there was a period halfway through where I just needed to step back and take a break for a minute, but there was never any doubt in my mind that I was going to get through this one at a good pace. Compare that to the Starleague Civil War series, where literally months would go by without any visible progress on the channel, or the Reunification War series, which I couldn't get going on and I felt almost certain I'd bitten off more than I can chew. This one had some good momentum pretty much right the way through to the end. It might have even been done quicker if I hadn't made several silly mistakes, but I'm definitely going to learn from those going forwards. But a large part of what's made this series so much fun for me is that it's had the best reception amongst you guys that anything I've done up to this point has. I've had more comments, more likes, more support than anything that's come before it, and I can't stress enough just how much that love and support has made a difference to me. Now, of course, people are going to ask, what am I doing next? Now, I did say this at the end of the Starleague series, but for those of you who weren't there for that, I am sticking to the Inner Sphere for now. I know that concurrently with the latter couple decades of the First Succession War, things are kicking off with Kerensky and his exodus, but all those events remain unknown to the people of the Inner Sphere in 3025, which is where I'm kind of grounding this series, and it's from that perspective I'm looking back. So the only natural place to go next is the Second Succession War. Now, I'm fairly sure the Second Succession War is going to be a shorter series than this one. In fact, this turned out to be about an hour longer than I thought it was going to be, wanted it to be, but I can't help myself from including more and more details. I'm fairly certain that this will remain forever now the second longest in this project, because all future events can be broken down into smaller chunks. The First Succession War just drags on for decades. Compare that to something like the Fourth Succession War or the Clan Invasion, well, those are only a couple of years each. So there might be more details to include, but it's a much smaller period of time to talk about. But besides the Second Succession War, I do have an idea to go back and revisit some untold stories of the Age of War as just very short 5 to 10 minute uploads, which I'll just drop every now and again. If I do that, I want to find one thing from each successor state to talk about. I think I've got 2 or 3 in mind at the moment, so I need to try and find a couple interesting points in the others. But also, one thing I would like to do in the new year is start a whole new lore and history project on a different franchise. I really enjoy making these, but sticking to just BattleTech is meaning that there are periods where I just need to take a break from it. And if I had another thing to focus on for a while, I could swap back and forwards and keep my enjoyment of making the videos going for much longer, I think. So with me in full script writing mode for December, I think the only uploads are going to be over the next month, just some random gameplay things. I'll post updates on how I'm doing on Patreon, so if you want to keep up to date, you can check the description and find a link to it there. So for one final time this year, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you will see me again in the new year for the Second Succession War.